Good evening, and welcome to the final fall lecture of the Harn Eminent Scholar Chair in Art History, or HESCAH, program at the University of Florida. My name is Maya Stanfield-Motzi, and as current chair of the HESCAH Steering Committee, I will introduce our program before turning to Dr. Eric Siegel, Director of Education at the Samuel P. Harn Museum of Art, who will introduce tonight's eminent scholar, Dr. Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw. The Harn Eminent Scholar Chair in Art History Endowment supports UF's School of Art and Art History's lecture series by outstanding art historians, critics, and curators. This endowment, gifted by the generosity of Dr. and Mrs. Coffrin, starting with the pledge in 1985, provides this forum for distinguished scholars to explore a range of perspectives related to art history. This fall's events are part 2 of our series that began last spring, called Art's Inclusive Histories, in celebration of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. They commemorate the centennial and chart avenues of further progress by highlighting research on Black women artists and female artists of color. Dr. DuBois Shaw's talk coincides with the exhibition currently on view at the Harn Museum, entitled Breaking the Frame: Women Artists in the Harn Collections. I encourage you to attend our events next spring. Our next lecture by Dr. Suzanne Stratton Pruitt on January 28th will be on art and death in the colonial Andes. For information, please go to our website, arts.ufl.edu/HESCAH. Thanks to all who have made this fall's program a great success, especially Macarena Dej Prado, Helena Chen, and Anne-Marie Furlong. I now give you Dr. Eric Siegel.
Thank you, Maya. It's so great to be here. Good evening, everyone. I'm Eric Siegel, Director of Education at the Harn Museum of Art, as Maya mentioned. At the Harn, we regularly partner with our colleagues in the School of Art and Art History and with the HESCAH program to present leading scholars who illuminate artists, artworks, and themes presented in the galleries. The current exhibition, Breaking the Frame: Women Artists in the Harn Collections, includes works both by Kara Walker and Carrie Mae Weems, who Professor Shaw will discuss this evening. Breaking the Frame remains on view currently through May 2021, and the museum is open for visitors, so we look forward to seeing you there. It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Professor Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw as a scholar whose work I much admire as a distinguished teacher and as someone who I enjoyed palling around with in grad school. Dr. Shaw is an art historian and a curator. After receiving her PhD in art history from Stanford University, she was appointed assistant professor of history of art and African American studies at Harvard University. And she's now the class of 1940 bicentennial term associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania. At Penn, she is affiliated faculty in Latin American and Latino studies, cinema studies, and gender, sexuality, and women's studies. Professor Shaw studies race, gender, sexuality, and class in the art of the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Her important publications include Seeing the Unspeakable, The Art of Kara Walker, Duke, 2004, Portraits of a People, Picturing African Americans in the 19th Century, which is a significant catalog for the exhibition that she curated at the Addison Gallery of American Art in Andover, Massachusetts, 2006. Other curatorial activities include her work on Represent African American Art, which was at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 2015, and her curating of Kara Walker, Virginia's Lynch Mob, and other works for the Montclair Art Museum in New Jersey in 2018. Dr. Shaw's prestigious awards and recognitions include fellowships at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study and at the National Portrait Gallery. As a postdoctoral fellowship, from the Ford Foundation, and a term as a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Washington. At Penn, she has been honored with the School of Arts and Sciences Award for Innovation in Teaching and with the Ira H. Abrams Memorial Award for Distinguished Teaching. I am really delighted to welcome, in just a moment, Professor Shaw. Before I do, let me mention that we're going to have time at the end of her talk for questions and answers. I invite you to watch the chat bar on the side and enter your questions there, and I'll be able to moderate them with Professor Shaw in conversation. So I'm now, as I say, delighted to invite Professor Shaw to speak on metabolizing memory, cyclical history in the work of Kara Walker and Carrie Mae Weems.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you to everybody at the university for welcoming me tonight. If we could bring up my presentation, I'll start with that. Great. So when I was asked to speak tonight, I was given a list of objects that were in the at the exhibition, and I wanted to speak to some of them, and so I chose Carrie Mae Weems and Kara Walker. There we go. Because these are two artists that I've written about and thought a lot about in the past 20 years or so. And these are the two pieces that are on view. And tonight, what I'll present to you is really a two-part presentation. I want to speak a little bit extemporaneously about Kara Walker, and then I'll give you a slightly more formal presentation on Weems. Walker was the subject of my dissertation, begun in the late 1990s and finished in the early 2000s as a book. And she's an artist that I followed on and off since then. Much of her work is focused on the history of African enslavement in the Americas, not only in North America, what is now the United States, but also the Caribbean, through a lens of horror and trauma, of kind of brutal violence and sexuality. And as Eric mentioned, in 2018, I was invited to do an exhibition of her work at the Montclair Art Museum in Montclair, New Jersey. And at first, I was when I met with the staff there, with the curators and the directors, they wanted to put together an exhibition that really put Walker's work in conversation with other artists in their collection. But it actually turned out that they had a really vast collection of her work. They had about 15 pieces, which is pretty unusual for a museum of that size. Many works by a contemporary artist like Walker. And so we were able to do what I term as a kind of mini retrospective of Walker's work. There will be a large retrospective of her work coming up in a year or so at MoMA. I think it's been delayed. It was supposed to be 2020, and that didn't happen thanks to COVID. So hopefully that will be coming up soon. But Walker's one of these artists who, unlike Weems primarily works in photography and installation, but photo-based installation. Walker's work covers the gamut of media. So this exhibition included large on the wall, as well as large-scale drawings, lithographs, and film, and maquettes for large sculptural works. For many folks, Kara Walker became a kind of destination artist in 2014 when she presented a subtlety, or the Sugar Baby, the Marvelous Sugar Baby, this large installation at the Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn, New York, as a part of a project that Creative Time commissioned her to do. And this was a monumental Sphinx-like figure, which took the guise of an African descended woman, kind of on all fours, facing outward like a Sphinx, and then surrounded by these small figures that have these baskets in their hand. The figures were also made out of sugar that had been pressed into molds, and the large Sphinx was made out of foam that had been sculpted and then sprayed with sugar. And if you've ever had sugar in a damp environment like Florida, you know that it can, it sucks up water and it can begin to melt. And so these little figures here would melt over the course of that installation. And so the exhibition really transformed and changed over time as people went to see it. Another large-scale sculptural piece that Walker made more recently, the Castawa Caravan. This was a piece that was done for Prospect 4 in New Orleans, the biennial or triennial art exhibition that has been mounted since Hurricane Katrina as a way to draw people to the New Orleans area to see art. And this caravan that she made housed a calliope, a large steam-powered musical device that was housed just inside. You can see it in the photograph on the left. And concerts, music was played through it by a number of musicians, including Jason Moran, a contemporary jazz composer. And it was placed at the dock at Algiers in New Orleans, which is where enslaved people were unloaded from ships coming from the Caribbean. And in the exhibition that I curated, we were able to include one of these little maquettes, one of these models, which you see on the right, which Walker produced in an edition of about 10 for sale as a way to raise money and to fund this larger the caravan, the calliope. And so one of the things that I've always found really unique about Walker, and that I'm terribly grateful for, as a graduate student, if you ever work, for people who work on contemporary art, it's a big roll of the dice when you choose contemporary artists to write about. You don't know if they're going to have legs, so to speak, and that their career will continue. But Walker's work has had that longevity, even though the style in which she works, of this cut paper, silhouette form, just the black form with an outer form line that gives you just a limited amount of information about what you're actually seeing, so that you have to fill in the details, the information, and whether you're making it grosser or more awful than it actually is something that is really in the mind of the viewer. That style has not changed over the last 25 years of Walker's career. But what has been most remarkable is the way that she's constantly moving out into different media and material. And then just this last year, I was invited to give a talk at the Tate Modern in celebration of the Fons Americanus, this enormous, ginormous sculpture that she was commissioned by the Tate to be housed in the Hyundai turbine terminal, and this in the turbine hall, excuse me. And I had hoped to get over there. I was not able to, unfortunately. My father passed away, and that kept me at home. And then on the next trip I was supposed to go, COVID held me back, and so I wasn't able to see this piece in person. And so it's hard for me to talk in great detail about it. I believe that one of the most critical things as an art historian is you have to be with the objects, to fully get them. And I was so sad not to be in the presence of this piece, which is truly impressive, and it shows that continuing ambitious scale that Walker is working within. So this is a fountain that was produced by digital means. So you really see the hand of the artist everywhere. She made little clay maquettes, and then they were digitally sized up and carved with the digital carving arm, and then clad in an impermeable material that allowed the piece to be plumbed and actually turned into a fountain. So this figure of a Black woman up at the top, quite literally is spouting out of her breast breasts, out of her nipples, water. And, this references, in many ways, the ways that enslaved women's bodies, were not their own, and the service as nursemaids to their owners, children, etc. And that, literally this American fountain, springs out of the body of this Black woman. And around the base, there are numerous sculptures, including this man in a boat, which draws on the history of art, which is very important to Walker in her work. She's always looking back at art history, and in this case, at Winslow Homer's The Gulf Stream, a painting which is all about the transportation of the perilous transportation of Black bodies across the Atlantic, between the Americas and Africa and England, but also between North America, between the United States and the Caribbean. Homer spent a good deal of time in the Caribbean, in the Bahamas, in Cuba, and in Bermuda during the 1880s and 90s. And the piece itself, The Fawns, is based on the Victoria Memorial, which Walker saw when driving through London. And, the Victoria Memorial, celebrating Queen Victoria's, triumph of creating an empire on which the sun never set, right? That crossed the whole world, and asserted the hegemony of the British Empire. So this is a comment, not only Walker's work with the Fons Americanus is a comment not only on kind of American history, but transatlantic history, imperial history, the kind of imperial history that the United States was writing for itself at the time, around 1898, when the U.S. first became an empire, when Homer was painting the Gulf Stream. Okay, so for Carrie Mae Weems, I wanted to give you something a little bit different. Had I been able to get to see the Fawns, I would have said more about it. But I've been thinking about Carrie Mae Weems's work, for a long time as well, and much of it really focuses on photography, and I wanted to dig into the way that she asks us to see and to look very differently. And to begin with this, I wanted to talk about the Louisiana Project, which was made in 2003. So I'm going to read this for you. It's about 10 pages, and then we'll go to question and answer. Okay. So in 2003, the Newcomb Art Gallery at Tulane University commissioned Carrie Mae Weems to create a piece in response to the impending bicentennial of the Louisiana Purchase. Comprised of over 70 separate photographs and screen prints, a video, and a live performance by the artist at its debut, the Louisiana Project examines both the distant past of slaveholding antebellum Louisiana and its recent present, characterized by economic crisis and racial segregation. The Louisiana Project juxtaposes the secrecy that surrounds the Mardi Gras Rex Ball, an exclusive event attended by members of New Orleans's white upper class, and the not-so-secret sexual liaisons had by the male scions of these elite families with African-American women from the adjacent communities of the gens de couleur, the people of color, throughout the 19th and 20th century. In the Louisiana Project, Weems continues an artistic practice of reinterpreting the facts of history by placing her own body within the extant detritus at its matrix. In many of the photographs that comprise the project, the artist stands with her back to the camera in front of an architectural edifice, amidst a rural landscape, or within a domestic interior. She wears period clothing, a plain long-sleeve dress that falls to the floor, evoking the daily wear of working-class women in the 19th century. In other photographs, her body faces the camera, and she wears masks and men's tuxedos. Susan Kahan has observed in the catalog for the project that, quote, Weems's focus on masking and facades underscores the notion that social hierarchies result from a differential in relations of power, not birthright, close quote. The masks, costumes, and choice to turn away from the camera prompt a reconsideration of the physical presence of history. And here I argue that by turning her back to the viewer, Weems also engages a long history of visual obfuscation associated with the sublime, a history that may most powerfully be seen in the work of David Casper Friedrich in his 1817 painting, Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. In this painting, Friedrich pictures the figure of a romantic wanderer at the top of a craggy peak somewhere in Saxony or Bohemia, looking out over a landscape that is shrouded in mist. With his back turned to the viewer, not only is his identity concealed, but also his expression. Is he delighted with the vista or horrified and aghast? His confident pose with left foot planted firmly on the penultimate step of the peak and his right side braced with a walking stick makes him appear unaffected by the strong wind that briskly blows his blonde hair to one side. There's little indication of a vertiginous instability, only a sense of mastery, despite the seeming insignificance of the lone walker himself. Like Friedrich's Wanderer, we do not have to see through Weems to know what she is seeing. Instead, we see through Weems. Weems prompts us to reconsider our understanding of domestic spaces and architecture as we gaze upon a photograph of her sitting in the grass before a Greek revival-style plantation home. Who lived here? Who looked out of those windows? Who walked those halls? Who died there? Whom did they love? What befell them? This process of what I term a kind of remembering of history, a metabolizing of memory through Weems's body and gaze tells us that the landscape and the buildings that populate it are always key players in multiple histories. By seeing through Weems as she moves through space, time, and place, we are privy to visions both real and ethereal. And in these pictures, we see a place that is on the edge of exploration and yet struggles valiantly to hold its own decay at bay. In his 2004 book, The Landscape of History, How Historians Map the Past, historian John Gaddis ruminates on Friedrich's Wanderer, using the painting and its sole figure as a metaphor for the way that we as historians can only represent the past by portraying it as a near or distant landscape. Quote, "We can perceive shapes through the fog and mist. We can speculate as to their significance, and sometimes we can even agree amongst ourselves as to what these are. We pride ourselves on not trying to predict the future, as our colleagues in economics, sociology, and political science attempt to do. We resist letting contemporary concerns influence us. The term presentism among historians is no compliment. We advance bravely into the future with our eyes fixed firmly on the past. The image we present to the world is, to put it bluntly, that of a rear end." Close quote. In the Louisiana Project, Weems shows us her backside in order to emphasize her own privilege as the primary holder of vision. Here, Weems is the revenant amongst the exteriors and interiors of Greek revival plantation homes, the disremembered specter standing on a stretch of deserted railroad, the haint traversing above-ground tombs, standing like Friedrich's figure in The Wanderer, poised on the brink, having come to a sublime vista, just a bit too late to find it at its peak. She makes us a witness to the landscape around her. Here, Louisiana has become the object of her gaze, a gaze that reads different visions than those seen by others, apocryphal visions. Through her wandering gaze, we encounter a landscape that is oddly predictive, one that in its mix of pasts, juxtaposing the slowly evanescing Greek revival architecture of the 1840s with the decrepit expanse of a mid-20th century public housing project, a sort of post-bellum slave quarters. In its poignant repetition of condition, she gives us a space that is predictive. In its mix of past and present, the landscape of the Louisiana Project is a landscape that is profoundly prescient in nature. A key component of this installation is a shadow drama of characters dressed in 18th century clothes engaging each other in a silhouetted tableau of domesticity, masquerade, and sexual domination. And when I first saw this piece, I immediately thought Kara Walker. You know, the influence going back and forth between these artists who are of two slightly different generations is pretty profound. Mardi Gras marks the annual outing of rituals that are both creative and destructive, defining and mystifying, a world in which things are turned on their head on purpose, a world in which transgression is constantly rewarded so long as it follows tradition. And this is what we see here. By providing the viewer with an other way to see Mardi Gras and the parades of Rex, Endymion, Orpheus, Zulu, and Bacchus, the crews of Mardi Gras, Weems remembers a new carnival through the age-old tradition of topsy-turvy. Mikhail Bakhtin describes this tradition as practiced in a pre-Enlightenment Europe as a social institution through which, and I quote, the temporary suspension of all hierarchic distinctions and barriers among men and the prohibitions of usual life was the rule, close quote. For Bakhtin, the carnivalesque, a term used to describe the kind of behavior displayed during these periods, is both the description of a historical phenomenon, the activities that took place during the great medieval carnivals of Europe, and the designation for specific literary tendencies, as well as a relation to our understanding of the physically grotesque. Bakhtin viewed such raucous festivities as regulated moments in time when the social authority of the secular and religious authorities was suspended, at least momentarily, for the ascendance of licensed transgression. Such communally sanctioned and essentially participatory festivals of the grotesque and fantastic allow participants to move beyond a regular membership within a crowd to become a part of a whole. In this way, to participate in Carnival, and in the case of New Orleans, to attend the parades of Mardi Gras, is to become a part of a collective in transgression. Within Carnival, asserts Bakhtin, all were considered equal. Here in the town square, a special form of free and familiar contact reigned among people who were usually divided by the barriers of caste, property, profession, and age, close quote. Carnival and its progeny, the Mardi Gras of New Orleans, both construct and deconstruct these social rules that govern transgression and trauma. The visual drama of Weems's installation works to conjure up a world of faded majesty, remembered beneath a veneer of deceit. An imaginary that evokes Louisiana's complicated and uneasy mythic legacy of race and gender, an imaginary in which Weems has inserted herself as a real and figurative witness to the romantic tales that we tell ourselves about slavery and the interracial sexuality of the Creole South. Tales that veil the legacy of enslavement and the conflicting truths about interracial sexual liaisons in the 18th and 19th centuries. Of all the myriad elements of the Louisiana Project, it is Weems's solitary Friedrichian wanderer and the physical constancy of the landscape in which she moves, a landscape that is as much a constructed character as the ones that Weems creates and embodies, that holds the pain of the past and the possibility of a future. I argue strongly for the project's prescience, for its ability to help us envision the future through visions of the past, for its oracular gift to see the reflexive nature of the present in relation to history. The Louisiana Project transforms Weems's body into a vehicle through which we are made to see, and at other times a body that we are made to see through. This task of specular transcendence is accomplished through images that posit the artist's physical presence in the picture plane as a momentary and yet ever-present imprint on time and space, so that representations of the past and recent futures can be seen through multiple perspectives. In this way, her body and the landscape in which she moves are made to hold that past and the pain of our individual and our collective trauma of enslavement, that kind of carnival trauma, as well as the historical blindness that has affected our understanding of the past, present, and the possible futures for Louisiana, and especially New Orleans, just 2 years later. This work was 2 years before Katrina. following that traumatic experience of the hurricane. Ultimately, the prescient nature of the Louisiana Project helps us to remember a number of traumatic pasts, all of which bear the mark of New World slavery. To experience the Louisiana Project, in which Weems constantly positions herself as a witness to both past and future histories, is to be confronted by one's own position as a viewer, and to acknowledge the ever-present power of the gaze and the perpetual struggle by women artists in their work and in their persons to control the gaze. Much of Weems's work during the past 3 decades has been about controlling the gaze, from the Kitchen Table series of 1990, in which we are asked to virtually join the artist and her models at one end of a table as silent witnesses to dramatic domestic events that unfold over a series of photographs, to the Jefferson Suite from 2001, where our spectatorial presence is alighted, and rechanneled as we consider the ramifications of genetic research in relation to race, ethics, and morality, as well as the American judicial system. In order to control both the narrative and the gaze, Weems enters her own work through a process of self-objectification. In the Jefferson Suite, we see the artist in several guises, most strikingly in the role of our third President Thomas Jefferson's enslaved consort, Sally Hemings. Here, Weems served as her own model, a role that she has frequently inhabited in her work, alternately dressed as Hemings and also undressed as an example of a genetic topos. Weems functioned as a focalizer for a visual tale of sexual attraction, political intrigue, and social deception that led the viewer from the 18th century through to the 1998 revelation, in scare quotes, of the Jefferson DNA study that scientifically demonstrated the connections between the Black Hemings family and the white Jefferson families. Weems collapsed time and space in the Jefferson Suite to rechannel the authority of voice into the body of one whose enslavement had imposed a loud silence in history. She encourages our gaze to wander across that historical legacy of unequal power relations and sexual attraction that spanned over 200 years of American history. And in the Louisiana Project, she continues this practice of inserting herself into a truly, in this case, apocryphal version of history. In this way, she mobilizes that wandering gaze. As an art historical theory of spectatorship, the gaze, of course, has its origins in the Lacanian film theory of Laura Mulvey. Mulvey's 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and the Narrative Cinema, of course, introduced the gaze as a theory of gendered spectatorial differences in popular 20th century film that helped to explain the ways that men and women view the world and each other on screen. Mulvey asks that we imagined a darkened movie theater in which every member of the audience has their eyes locked on the screen. All vision follows the cone of light that travels from one side of the theater to the other, from the projection booth to the screen. And in this scenario, Mulvey places an active male viewer seated in the theater and a female image on the screen. It is a kind of perennial geometry through which male vision consumes the female image. In the past 30 plus years, however, much has been written to dispute Mulvey's argument that cinematic vision is posited as male and heterosexual. Feminist film scholars from B. Ruby Rich to Teresa de Lauretis to Linda Williams have since argued that the relationship of female viewers to the screen image is less patriarchal and more dialectical. They argue that the female viewer retains more agency through a selective filtering process. Williams, for one, encourages a questioning of, quote, the orthodoxies of classical spectatorship without abandoning the fundamental importance of the spectators who gaze at film, glance at it, or avert their eyes from it, close quote. Rich pushes back a bit more firmly against the dominance of gaze-based Lacanian psychoanalytic feminist film criticism, charging it with an unblinking ahistoricity that fails to account for, quote, the key determinants of context, audience, or even aesthetic fashion, close quote. Similarly, de Lauretis argues that the importance of, quote, engaging all of the codes of cinema to articulate the conditions and forms of vision for another social subject as a way to broaden the possibilities for the production and counter-production of social vision, close quote. The idea that only one person could be interpolated into the subject of the gaze, the primary person who could be called forth to be the gazer, if you will, would be a man whose sexualized vision would contain the female object on the screen in an unequal power relation, is simply not tenable when you begin to think about the multiplicity of points of vision that are possible in a contemporary expanded viewing environment. Simply put, there are multiple points of view, and Weems's wandering gaze allows multiple individuals to occupy the position of power as the holder of the gaze, regardless of gender identity, regardless of sexual orientation, and regardless of race. With the wandering gaze, we can allow ourselves the freedom to move into an expanded field of vision. If we begin to conceive of visual art as unbound narrative, we can read images as connecting not only to a past, but also a present and a future as well. In this way, we begin to see how a multifold increase in the diversity of vision would inform the interpretation of the moment of viewing in a more complicated way than those provided for by the simple assumption of a uniform, heterogeneous, white world. A world in which the ability of class, ethnicity, and education to separate whites from one another is ignored and sublimated beneath a brittle veneer of pink-skinned sameness. The wandering gaze allows us to step inside the skin of Friedrich's omniscient white subject, who above the mist commands the landscape below him. We are aware of our own significance standing astride the peaks of history and our utter insignificance as one of many who has risen to consciousness only to fall. We not only dominate our field of vision, but we also falter in its sublimity, which proves to diminish our standing. What is offered by an expansion into the wandering gaze is an ever more inclusive theory of vision in which myriad spectators, regardless of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, can be empowered agents of their own pleasure and, I would argue, their own pain, experiencing vision as an ever-widening field of subjective choice and experience. In this way, multiple identifications are possible, and increasingly we are better able to grasp the association of power with various race and gendered positions in society and see how a multifold increase in the diversity of vision would inform the interpretation of the moment of viewing in more complicated ways and allow for multiple identifications. And it is this type of viewing, that of gazing back at the past from the perspective of the present, that the Louisiana Project opens for its audience. Weems's photographs push us to recognize that you can see through me and you can see through me, regardless of my original position or yours. After all forms of knowledge are channeled through our experience as individuals within specific cultural moments. As the artist allows his or her work to move out, or their work to move out into the world, it is constantly reinterpreted through each individual act of viewing. And the photographs of the Louisiana Project present multiple visualities rather than being the result of a single visualization. In this expanded visual and temporal field, we begin to see that this vision is embodied in this wandering gaze as intervention into the meta-narrative, creating a number of differing histories beyond the present and into the past and into an ever-present yet ever-changing landscape. However, such an approach requires that the viewer not be lured into the notion that Weems, the narrator, is the same person as Weems, the model. For these images and those she has created previously in the kitchen table series of the Jefferson Suite are not unbidden snapshots or autobiographical records, but rather are staged images in which the artist has assumed a role that is of her own conception and creation. It is not Carrie Mae Weems, the narrator, who stands in the doorway of a Greek revival plantation house with her back to the camera. That Weems stands outside the photograph in the role of what Mike Ball would call the focalizer, the visual focalizer, initiating and directing vision into the distance. We are viewpointed by her, to her, and through her we see the land beyond the building. She is the intercessor through whom we come to know the landscape of the past in a new and different way. Through the wandering gaze of the Louisiana Project, we see the relation of trauma to the visualization of memory and the act of forgetting or refusing to see in relation to our irrevocable separation from the Lacanian notion of the real. And to view the Louisiana Project is to see the undead New Orleans of the past, a world that is no more and yet resists erasure through the reassurance of the ritual of Mardi Gras. The Louisiana Project creates a space for the dramatization of individual and collective memory, a space in which personal and communal trauma is shared. Through these multiple points of focalization that Weems's wandering gaze marshals, viewers become open to the multiple narratives that are possible within the spaces of her address. Domestic architecture is no longer home so much as it is place in which reanimated bodies move through a landscape and architecture that is eternal and ever-changing, enacting relationships that are predicated on social structures at once remote and yet wholly familiar. It is the scene of the crime, and Weems's presence in it is as much accusation as it is reflection. As our wandering gaze is focalized through Weems, we see New Orleans as a matrix of communities afloat in the wake of an antebellum history of enslavement, a postbellum product of segregation, and in the contemporary moment, a city still marked, in this contemporary moment, by post-Katrina displacement, creative resurrection, such as Prospect 4, at which the Castawa Caravan of Karawaka was displayed, and creeping gentrification. To view and review the Louisiana Project is to see the future through visions of the past, and through this oracular gift to see the ever-reflexive nature of the present in relation to the past. The act of prescient reconstruction and stitching back together of the past affected Weems's wandering gaze, brings into focused terrestrial revenants to cloud our vision like the mists before Friedrich's wanderer, in the absences, in the vacated landscapes that endure both before and beyond. We may reflect on the roles we ourselves have played in the past, in the present, and in the future. Thank you.
Wow, Gwendolyn, fabulous. Thank you so much for speaking to Kara Walker and to Carrie Mae Weems. Works which are both on view and breaking the frame, and two artists of such great import. I know a lot of our viewers have been very anxiously and happily anticipating your talk, and really have been enjoying it along with me. Lots of questions are rolling around. I was totally fascinated by your discussion of Weems, starting off with including your comparison or using the linchpin of Friedrich's Wanderer, and the idea of representation and identification that you open up, which at times I was like worried, how does this work? And then you kept unfolding it further. So to identify as a white male viewer or for any number of viewers with a figure in a Weems photograph opens up problematic terrain of all kinds. I was really fascinated about how you sort of mapped out, literally almost mapped out Weems's way of ensuring that identification wasn't an easy, pleasurable one, that you got to have a fantasy about occupying this body and seeing through this body. I'm wondering if you could just return to that and discuss a little bit more her strategies for making her images open to a broad range of viewers, and yet not letting them too easily imagine themselves into them.
Yeah, I think, Carrie Mae Weems is such an interesting artist, and her work has changed a lot over the years, and then also, not so much. And the piece that's in your exhibition, really struck me because she's not in it. And and it's one of the few works of hers, the few series where she does not appear, and where she allows other women to fully take the stage, and to occupy the frame. But usually she places herself, right in there and occupies that key role. And in thinking about her work, in a lot of ways, it's very narcissistic, that it does that it includes her as the most important protagonist, at least in her photograph work that that draws on pieces, that doesn't draw specifically on the archive and repurposing archival photographs, which series like From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried from the late 90s certainly did, where she rephotographed images of enslaved people from archives like Harvard's Peabody Museum, as a way of recontextualizing and bringing people into personhood and making them into portraits as opposed to into specimens. And so she's has such a unique background, having pursued a PhD in folklore at UC Berkeley. She's very interested in stories, and I reference narrative in the paper because she really is a narrator or a narratrix, and she wants to tell you a story, and she wants to tell you the story. She wants to be the one to control it. And so often she will include text either overlaid over images or beneath it to help to guide your interpretation, your understanding of, what she's sharing with you visually. And this is something that she's still very active in. She has a project right now which is directed at COVID and at reaching people in the public sphere around mask wearing and around the importance of essential workers. And so many of her photographs from the early 80s have been repurposed with new text below them that speaks to COVID, and they've been rolled out in different cities. And it's been interesting to see the way that she is drawing on her past, archive, her past, body of work, in order to address the contemporary moment. And she really is very, very concerned with how she fits into history in that way. And I think I have strayed from your initial question.
To good effect in any case.
Okay.
And well worth it. So I'm interested. I was really interested in how you described that she invites you to identify with her and see through her.
Yeah.
But also resists you either mistaking her as the character in the photograph, and therefore pulling the ground out from under you from identifying too easily, too comfortably. And you just, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I say that, she really is looking at a history of Black women's vision also that we might connect up with the late Toni Morrison's great novel The Bluest Eye, for example, which talks about the inability of Black women and girls to see themselves as beautiful, and how crushing that can be for women and girls who are not able to love themselves. And in The Bluest Eye, that's the great tragedy of the book is a girl who descends into insanity through self-hatred, through self-loathing. And the linchpin in that book is a scene in which the girl Piola, in which her mother goes to the theater and sees on the screen, white actresses, and internalizes, through her gaze, a gaze that is not intended for her to have. She is not the intended viewer of that film, sitting up there in the balcony, in the Jim Crow balcony, but rather it is a white viewer who is intended to metabolize that vision, to take that in as the gazer. And that disruption in reception of the gaze destroys Piccola's mother, and ultimately, destroys her. And I think, Weems's work is in a lot of ways about, it's a corrective to those histories, saying that, that vision, channeled through a Black female body, is just as powerful and a proprietary. And that, and what does it mean? How can you, as a white man, how does it change your vision to look through that Black female body, to be intentionally channeled and directed and focalized as Mike Ball says, through that body. What does that mean, and how does it throw you back on yourself and your ways of viewing and what you see, and disrupt that. Hopefully, it's not as damaging as it was, in Morrison's novel.
In some ways, Kara Walker's work would disagree with the hopefully it's not as damaging. I mean, she throws your vision back on you. In your words were, with horror, trauma, violence, and of course sexuality. Whereas Weems, everything she does is equally powerful, but not gentler, but more in the tone of mourning and hope, I think. And I love the way you talked about looking towards the past and seeing through it towards the future, her gesture there, but more mournful than traumatic in Walker's work. So I would love to ask you a little bit about, maybe we should talk to Walker's work in just a moment. I'm going to check the chat here because there's a question or a comment or thought about your Weems section, asking, this is a question sort of, is the wandering gaze a play on the wandering eye, that a euphemistic term for predatorial male sexuality? Were you playing off of that, or is that a coincidence for you?
Oh, I think that's a happy coincidence. I think they are related. That this notion of the wandering the wandering eye as being that as being predatory, and as being kind of uncontrollable. It's a contrast here, because the wandering gaze is totally under control. It's a purposeful wander, just as Friedrich's wanderer has gotten to the top of that peak on purpose. I think that, he knew where he was going. He wanted to summit that mountain, and Weems is interested in controlling that gaze. That's why she has to be there. She doesn't want you, looking anywhere but in a place that has her at the center of it. In very few of those images is she anywhere but at the center of the picture frame. And so it very much is about the what do you call it? Perspective, like perspectival lines, kind of like the ones behind my head in this room, lining up, in the center to bring you and to create depth, and to create that visual depth and channel your vision. Whereas I think the wandering gaze is more connected, for me, to the flaneur, right? To the subject who wanders the streets, and without aim, just checking out whatever good is going on, and where he ends up, he arrives. And so I see it as not having quite the same kind of intended destination.
Yeah, a real sense of control and intentionality. And thinking about Kara Walker. Oh, someone's letting me know that there's problems posting to the chat. So not everyone who wants to chat is able to ask their questions, unfortunately. But in turn to Kara Walker, I thought for our audience, which is to say for me also, I'd love to hear a little about your thoughts on her use of stereotype, because this, she's been committed since the 90s to the kind of visual language, even as she explores different media, this kind of visual language that she uses. And she's been, as you know better than I do, intensively critiqued by many artists for her use of stereotype, painful stereotype, wounding stereotype. And I'd love for you to give us a sense of that argument and your understanding of the utility of stereotype in Kara Walker's work. It's actually not a word you use, I don't think, in your conversation.
Yeah, I mean, stereotypes are difficult things because they're not always bad, right? A stereotype is something that helps us to recognize, a form by regularizing the way it's presented, and so they're not always detrimental. For Walker, she occupied a very difficult position early in her career because she was awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant when she was 27 years old, and she was, this is something that comes with a couple $100,000, and no other Black artists had gotten them before her. And there was a whole legacy of amazing artistic production by artists of African descent in the United States that had totally, been overlooked. And so there was a lot of blowback when that happened, and she encountered a lot of really awful critique that much of which was very sexist, and was linked to issues of her youth, her inexperience. One writer said, when she grows up and has babies, she'll understand better the awful things that she's doing. And Cara has not changed that much in the last, 25 years or so. Her daughter's now like 26 or something, and she's still doing her thing. And it really does her images really do come from a kind of, a deep well of ick that she's able to draw on and deploy with, mesmerizing deftness. And she picks up all of these different threads of American history of the Americas, history of the United States, histories of Europe, and the slave trade. And because she's working in silhouette, which does not give very much information, right? There's just that outer form line that she's working with. She has to perform what one could call stereotyping in order to make the figures readable, right? So she emphasizes racialized aspects of different bodies so that they are recognizable to us. And because we're so conditioned to read, thick lips and big bottoms as parts of Black bodies, and we're able to recognize them as Black bodies, but we are the ones who are recognizing them.
That's right.
We are the ones who are creating those images as we look at the outer form line, and we are the ones who are signing that racial identity, because in most cases, these silhouettes are all Black on a white background. In a very few projects that she did early on, she worked with other colors of paper and backgrounds like white and gray. And she ceased to do that around 1999, 2000. So there's so much of what people dislike is actually coming from inside of them when they look at Walker's work. So, when they see, this is not to say that she's not setting up a lot of really dastardly stuff. And when I was most actively writing about her work in the late 90s and early 2000s, I had to choose pretty carefully what I wanted to look at all day, because some of it was just awful. And I didn't want to see, people being impaled through their anuses on stakes and things like. I didn't want to look at that all day long. So I chose very specific pieces to write about. More recently, I think her work, has been about how people view it. So, for example, with the sugar baby, with the Sphinx at the Domino Sugar Factory, because it was necessary for security reasons to have cameras all over that space, they recorded a great deal of footage of people coming to view that piece. And the backside of that piece presents the buttocks of the figure and the labia, very large, and people would go up to it. And this was like when Instagram was really, starting to hit, and people would go up and they would stick their tongue out, as though they were licking it. And the change in scale made it look like, they were actually having, performing oral sex on the sculpture. And so she followed those Instagrams, and she made a documentary film about people's interactions with the piece, which were often really, really vile. And just like what I cited there, and so she's just as interested in showing what she is thinking about as learning what we are thinking about and how we engage and interact with what she presents.
Yeah, it's like a more highly aesthetic, thoughtful, and resonant Borat, kind of like letting people expose themselves.
Yeah.
But what you said about the vision that she evokes and how her works help you to discover the evil inside you by recognizing race in such awful images is really powerful. I just had to do everyone watching this probably had to do implicit bias training here at UF today or in the next coming weeks. We just, it's a new training.
Oh, I've done it many times.
Yeah.
And I'm always surprised. I'm never surprised, but I'm always surprised like by how little I know and how much awfulness is like peeking out. Go on.
This was a good starter training. It used a lot of silhouette. I was really fascinated about that, like male, female, green person, blue person, racism, rainbow person, blue person, homophobia.
I haven't done that training.
Yeah, it's a new but what she's doing in her work is making you not just realize intellectually your implicit bias, but to experience it by recognizing that these are inside of you. These awful images are already there. So I find them very powerful. Her work very powerful in that regard. Just checking. People are fascinated by the talk. That's great. I wanted to, maybe as we're rounding out our conversation, because it's already past 7, think a little bit about and maybe this is too big a question, and so you'll bite off the part that you like, but both Walker and Weems are dealing with history, especially in the Weems works that actually in an Art 21 video, Walker says that she can't be responsible for telling American history. It's too big. It's not her job, but she nonetheless engages with American history. And you remarkably pointed out sort of transatlantic history as well and global trade history. So for Weems, you really helped us think about her future-looking, sort of this element of hope, and in her work, right, looking to the past to imagine a future. With Walker, I'm not trying to ask you to interpret Walker, but in her artworks, is there a future that you see when you think about her work? Because it's antebellum, right, intensively in its figures and themes. Can you imagine a future out of Kara Walker's work when you look at it?
Her work is this may be one aspect where the market, I think, really does have a hand. In 1998, I went and saw an exhibition of her work at the old Worcester Gardens gallery that became Sycamore Jenkins, which is her gallery representation now. Yeah. And in that exhibition, there were a lot of these, large-scale silhouettes, and then other media that she was working with, including these mirrors that she was painting on. And the mirrors had been scavenged purchased from swap meets, yard sales, that kind of thing. And they were from the 1970s. And they had like beer advertisements on it, like Schlitz, that kind of thing. And they would have been, right at home in a 1970s, Black families rec room, middle-class families rec room. And she was really working with the 1970s and that period in which, she was a child. And that work didn't sell. It didn't. that recent past did not have a future for her career, and so in some ways, I really think that the market has encouraged her to stay within a historical framework. Now, just a few years ago, 2017, she did a phenomenal show at Sycamore Jenkins that when you walked into it in the Meatpacking District in New York City, next door is like Matthew Mark's gallery or whatever. There were a couple people in there. There were a couple people, in the other galleries nearby. But when you went into Sycamore Jenkins, it was packed. It was full of people and they were all silent. And these were large-scale drawings that she had made critiquing the Trump administration, and putting President Trump right at the center of a contemporary Death of Sardanapalus by Delacroix, right? With on like a mountain of shit. He was reigning supreme with his minions. And I'm just describing what she did. This is not a personal opinion here. And people were absolutely, in shock and awed at how she was taking a present reality and connecting it to history painting and and to all of these pasts that again, cyclical history, right? I'm super interested in cyclical, like all of these things keep going around, right? So on the one hand, very much like Thomas Cole's The Course of Empire, if you will, that she sees all of these steps along the way as being both present and historical, and constantly, a part of of one another. So for her, in those large scale drawings, and we were able to include one of them in the show at Montclair. In those large scale drawings, she was using a form, and she's done a lot of these gouache drawings, sometimes coffee drawings, using coffee as a as a colonial product, right? As a product of colonialism, and just as sugar was, right? Making these drawings as a way, through the gesture, through her body, to get out her frustration and her anger over current present and president that was taking us back into a past that was so which she had tried to exorcise, right? To free the demons. So, through her work. And here we were in a moment that was, bringing all of, these things kind of back into the present, showing how they had never disappeared, really. And, how things have just, kind of been beneath the surface. So if there is a future that Walker has shown us, it really was a present as a warning. That if things don't change, if they continue, we're going right back into right back there with Sardanapalus on that bed of death.
And the ruins of the Thomas Cole painting. Yeah. So wow, that is a great warning for our future. It just means we all have a lot of work to do. But I want to thank you for your work tonight in opening up the art of Kara Walker and of Carrie Mae Weems for us to expand our minds and to bring us closer to art of the present and our own present. So Gwendolyn, thank you so much for sharing your work this evening. Thank you so much for all you've done for American art as a discipline, because you have been influential in shifting it towards a more inclusive, deeper, more profound practice. And it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks everybody for joining us. You're welcome. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. Remember, the Harn Museum is open currently 4 days a week. Check our website for the hours. And Breaking the Frame is on view through 2021. And that includes two of the works that Gwendolyn discussed tonight. So thanks for joining us. Good night.